January 1945. Luxembourg City. The air inside the Third Army Awards Review Board is stagnant, thick with the smell of old paper and wood polish. A captain stands before a mahogany desk, his hand trembling slightly as he points to a file marked with a bold red stamp. Across from him, the board president calmly slides a thin stack of papers into a drawer, effectively burying a young man's life-altering sacrifice under the weight of bureaucratic indifference. It is an act of quiet, calculated erasure, a deliberate theft of valor. But the captain has no intention of letting the truth disappear into a filing cabinet. Outside, the war rages on, but inside these walls, a different kind of fight is just beginning. One that will soon bring a 4-star general through the door to ensure that justice is not just written, but enforced. This is the story of what happened when a desk officer quietly stole a black soldier's medal. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show the moments that forced people to face what they'd done. Private First Class Robert Tucker was 21 years old and hailed from the crowded, bustling streets of Harlem, New York. He had enlisted to prove his worth in a country that often saw him only for the color of his skin, carrying with him the memory of his father's quiet dignity and the promise he made to his mother to return home safely. During the grueling winter campaign, he had seen men go down in the mud and felt the sting of loss when his best friend was cut down by machine gun fire during a push near the border. Tucker was the kind of soldier who moved without hesitation when the order came, driven by a fierce loyalty to the men who stood in the foxhole beside him. It was this deep-seated sense of duty that pushed him forward that morning, charging a German position alone after his squad was pinned down, grenades in hand, determined to silence the threat that had silenced his brothers. Colonel Arthur Maynard was 49 years old, a man who occupied his high-backed chair at the Third Army Awards Review Board like a king on a throne. He hailed from Portland, Oregon, and viewed the military hierarchy as a rigid ladder where certain rungs were simply not meant for everyone. He believed deeply that valor was a quality defined by pedigree and background, rather than by action, holding a conviction that black soldiers were incapable of the disciplined courage required for high honors. He maintained his influence with a chilling, quiet efficiency, keeping 2 stacks of papers on his desk. The tall stack was for white soldiers, processed with haste and approval. The short stack was always for black soldiers, processed last and dismissed first. His uniform was always perfectly pressed. His boots gleamed with a mirror shine that reflected his vanity, and he took a perverse, quiet pleasure in wielding his pen like a weapon to prune the records of men he deemed unworthy of the praise they had so clearly earned on the field of battle. By January 1945, the European theater was a grinding furnace. The Allied advance had slowed to a crawl against the stubborn German defense, and the freezing winter conditions turned the landscape into a desolate expanse of mud and ice. Supply lines were pushed to their breaking point, and the reality of prolonged attritional warfare began to wear down the structure of command. In this environment, the pressure on officers to maintain order and manage the massive flow of logistics often led to friction between the front lines and the rear echelons. Desk-bound administrators, tasked with the mundane but essential work of processing reports and awards, were largely insulated from the violent, chaotic reality faced by men in the field. This separation allowed for a disconnect that bred administrative complacency. Many officers, buried in paperwork far from the front, had developed a habit of overlooking the complexities of battlefield reports, relying on rigid, outdated criteria to filter out what they did not value. For months, such gatekeepers had quietly dismissed or downgraded the actions of those they deemed unworthy, consistently favoring their own internal biases over verified accounts of courage. Because there was so little oversight regarding the final approval of decorations, these systemic biases were allowed to fester, unchecked and unscrutinized. It was a failure of the military bureaucracy that eroded trust and morale at the most critical juncture of the war, turning the simple task of honoring sacrifice into a tool for exclusion. As the situation continued to deteriorate in the administrative offices of Luxembourg City, The quiet, methodical erasure of service remained hidden, waiting for a single, undeniable truth to force the issue back into the light of the scene described earlier. Captain Elias Vance, 34, from Chicago, Illinois, entered the office with a thick file tucked under his arm. He placed it squarely on the desk in front of Colonel Maynard. The paperwork detailed the actions of Private First Class Robert Tucker. Vance stood straight, his eyes fixed on the man behind the desk. "Captain, you are trespassing on my time," Maynard said, not looking up from his ledger. "I am here about the distinguished service cross-recommendation for Private Tucker," Vance replied, his voice level. "It has been reviewed, processed, and downgraded to a bronze star," Maynard answered, finally leaning back and folding his hands. "The original citation is 3 pages long, signed by 4 white witnesses who saw him take that machine gun nest." Vance pressed, tapping the file. "The paperwork does not support the higher award," Maynard said, his tone dismissive. "The paperwork is identical to the recommendation of a white corporal who received the DSC last month for less," Vance countered. "My standards are not subject to your interpretation of other files," Maynard stated, his smile thin. "There is a clear pattern here, Colonel," Vance said, his voice hardening. "A pattern of insufficient documentation for certain personnel," Maynard replied, his eyes narrowing. "These men are dying for the same ground," Vance said, leaning forward. "They are doing their jobs," Maynard answered, waving a hand at the room. "They are doing more than their jobs, and they have earned the recognition." Vance argued, "They have received what I deemed appropriate, and that is final," Maynard stated, his voice rising slightly. "I cannot accept this, and neither can the men in the regiment," Vance said, his hand gripping the edge of the desk. "Then you are welcome to file a formal protest, but it will be buried in the same pile as your request," Maynard sneered. "You are actively stealing the courage of these men," Vance said, his face flushing. "I am maintaining the integrity of the board, and your insolence is noted," Maynard replied, standing up to his full height. "This is not integrity. It is prejudice, plain and simple," Vance declared. "Get out of my office before I have you removed for conduct unbecoming an officer," Maynard hissed. "I will take this to the 3rd Army Command," Vance stated. The report reached Patton within the hour. The door creaked open. A heavy silence filled the room. Patton stepped inside. His arrival was abrupt, unannounced, and absolute. The 4 stars on his steel helmet caught the light, and the ivory handles of his revolvers hung low at his hips. He stopped in the center of the floor. He did not speak, yet every man in the room stood rigid, eyes fixed forward, breath held tight. He looked at Maynard. The colonel's face turned pale. Patton gestured toward the desk. He asked, "Is this the file for Private Robert Tucker?" Maynard stammered. "Yes, General," Patton asked. "And you downgraded his Distinguished Service Cross?" Maynard nodded, barely audible. "Yes, sir," Patton continued. "And you claim 4 white witnesses are insufficient?" Maynard swallowed hard, saying, "I thought the documentation." Patton cut him off, his voice low and sharp. "Did you read the citation?" Maynard whispered. "I did." Patton took the file. He flipped through the pages, his movements deliberate. He stopped, looking up at the colonel. He began to speak, his voice cutting through the stagnant air of the office. "You have spent your time here acting as a gatekeeper of courage, weighing the worth of men based on your own internal prejudices. You have ignored the blood spilled in the dirt and the lives saved by a soldier who stood up when others were pinned down. You have decided that some men are not worthy of the honor they have earned, while others are handed commendations for half the effort. This is not the standard of this army. This is the theft of a man's honor, and it will not stand under my command. You have been stealing courage from men who have earned it with their lives. That theft stops today. You have a choice. Comply with the order to reinstate this award and accept a reassignment to the front lines where you will see exactly what this soldier endured, or be stripped of your rank and relieved of duty immediately. Decide now." Maynard stood trembling, his arrogance evaporated. He did not speak, but he bowed his head in silent, total submission. The order was executed immediately. Patton walked out, leaving the board in a stunned silence. 2 MPs marched into the room, their faces like stone. They approached Maynard. The colonel did not resist. He watched as they stripped the stars from his collar, the metal clicking against the floorboards as they hit the wood. The room smelled of wet wool and floor wax. Outside, the rain hammered against the tent canvas, a rhythmic, unforgiving sound that filled the void left by Maynard's silence. He saw the contempt in the eyes of the other officers as they witnessed the removal. There was no shouting, no debate, just the cold, mechanical sound of justice being served in the same place where the crime had been committed. The MPs escorted him out through the mud, past the rows of parked jeeps, toward the transport that would take him away from the Third Army forever. The witnesses turned back to their work, but the atmosphere had shifted. The desks were no longer places of quiet dismissal, but stations of accountability. By sunset, the story had reached every unit in the sector. The message was clear. Courage was not a commodity to be traded or buried, and the cost of stealing it was the end of a career. Private First Class Robert Tucker returned to the United States in late 1945, carrying his Distinguished Service Cross and the heavy, quiet weight of what he had witnessed in the mud of Luxembourg. He moved back to Harlem, finding work in a local warehouse and living a modest, steady life that allowed him to provide for his aging mother. He rarely spoke of the war, though he kept his medal tucked away in a velvet-lined box on his dresser until his passing in 1904, known by his neighbors as a man of uncommon stillness and grace. Colonel Arthur Maynard did not fare as well. Stripped of his rank and court-martialed for his conduct, he served 3 years in military prison before being dishonorably discharged in 1948. He returned to Oregon a bitter man, spending the remaining decades of his life in near-total isolation, often seen staring out the window of a small apartment at a world he no longer understood and that had long since forgotten his name. He died in 1972, leaving behind nothing but a legacy of resentment and the memory of the day he was forced to stand down. Patton never spoke of the incident in his memoirs or public addresses, keeping the official report buried deep in his private archives. He understood the nature of justice, treating it not as a political maneuver, but as a necessary correction to the machinery of war. In a private letter written to his wife shortly after the event, he briefly noted that he had cleared some deadwood from his staff, remarking only that a man who could not recognize valor did not belong in a position to judge it. Some historians have argued that administrative reviews during the heat of wartime are inevitably subject to human error and the pressures of rapid mobilization. They suggest that systemic failures were less about individual malice and more the result of an overwhelmed bureaucracy, unable to maintain consistent standards across diverse units. Others argue the opposite, pointing out that such systemic downgrades were often rooted in deep-seated, institutionalized biases that intentionally marginalized the contributions of specific groups. What is certain is that the review board in Luxembourg underwent a permanent change in leadership following that investigation, and every previously downgraded award for the entire region was audited and corrected within the following 3 months. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have opted for a softer alternative? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the moments that forced people to face what they'd done, make sure to subscribe.